I'll be doing a lot of videos by request this month, but for now, I wanted to respond to a comment on the terrorist attack in London because it's relevant to another topic I've gotten dozens of requests about, Canada's Motion 103. Michael Gardner says, I live in the UK. I was listening to the radio on the day that Muslim murdered them people. An Islamic group in London then went to London and started being all nice and PC. The radio station had someone phoning up saying they were interested in the Islamic faith after seeing the nice Muslims. Even after the Twin Towers, people became interested in Islam. What is going on? Well, Michael, you've noticed something that I've also noticed. Namely, that after every terrorist attack, there's a surge in interest in Islam, and some people actually convert to Islam after hearing what a wonderful religion it is. I wrote an article on this in 2005 on the day of the 7/7 bombings in London. The article was titled, "The Two Faces of Islam Still Smiling, Why All Muslims Benefit from Terrorism." Notice, I don't say that all Muslims promote or participate in or like terrorism. Many Muslims don't. But all Muslims benefit from terrorism. Here some of you Muslim viewers are thinking, what? We don't benefit from terrorism. Terrorism leads to Islamophobia. Yeah, but you use that Islamophobia to claim victim status and to demand laws against criticizing Islam and to get airtime on news networks to spread your religion, don't you? So you use the terrorist attacks to your advantage. Again, I saw this well over a decade ago. Let's read a bit of it. My hungry toddler woke me up this morning. After making his breakfast, I turned on my computer and found that London had just been struck by terrorists. As I watched news clips for the next few hours, I noticed that, for many in the West, the terror attacks brought back painful memories of September 11th, 2001. For me, it was a little different. My thoughts weren't drawn to the attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, but to an attack on a local mosque that took place shortly thereafter. Following the 9/11 attacks, a few enraged vandals smashed the windows of the Islamic Center near Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. When the pastor of a nearby church saw the students vandalizing the mosque, he called the police. Later in the day, police and school officials held a meeting to help ease some of the tension. After the meeting, an angry attendee caused a brief panic when he claimed that Islam is a religion of violence and bloodshed and that the terrorists were only doing what they were commanded to do in the Quran. Several people, including myself, argued against him, confidently assuring the man that Islam is actually a religion of peace. My beliefs about Islam have changed since then, mostly because I've studied Islam. Nevertheless, I recently realized why I had been so quick to defend the Muslim religion. Over the years, I've known several Muslims, and they have all been kind, peaceful individuals. Indeed, despite the popular portrait of Muslims burning flags and desecrating images of George Bush, the majority of Muslims are normal, faithful, peaceful people going about their daily lives with no intention of blowing up buildings or of burning anyone's flag. Many in the West deny this, but they typically do so because they have never so much as talked to a Muslim. The benevolent nature of these Muslims has a profound psychological effect on Westerners. It causes us to say, wait a minute, Islam can't be bad because Muslims are such nice people. Thus, the terrorists who blow up buildings and subways must be extremists. Once we have convinced ourselves of this, we may even find ourselves defending Islam, as I once did. We know that people are angry at terrorists, and we know that some of these angry people may want to take out their anger on Muslims. So we end up defending Islam in order to protect our Muslim friends. While protecting people is certainly a noble goal, defending Islam is an entirely different story. This is what Michael Gardner saw happening after the recent attack in London. There's a terrorist attack by some individual or group, and we don't want people who had nothing to do with the attack to be blamed for it, so we rush to their defense. News programs do this by getting a number of peaceful Muslims on their programs to show that there are plenty of Muslims who don't support terrorism. But these peaceful Muslims use their time in the spotlight to tell viewers and listeners about the wonderful religion of Islam. Some of these viewers and listeners like what they hear, and instead of carefully studying the Muslim sources to see where the evidence lies, they go to a local mosque, where they convert to Islam after being fed a bunch of complete nonsense. I've heard this story over and over again. I converted to Islam after the 9/11 attacks. Really? What was it about the 9/11 attacks that convinced you that Islam is true? Well, after the attack, I wasn't sure what to think about Islam, but a mosque in my area was having an event where we could ask questions, so I went. And that's where I learned that Islam is a religion of peace, and that Muhammad was a champion of women's rights, and that the Quran is filled with miraculous scientific knowledge. So I converted. Not too keen on careful research, are you? What's research? So, terrorist attacks lead to tons of free airtime for Muslim speakers, and this leads to conversions. And both peaceful Muslims and violent Muslims want to see people convert to Islam. Both faces of Islam get what they want. But there's something else that both faces of Islam want. They want to silence critics of Islam, and that's what terrorist attacks do, in more ways than one. Later in the article, I discuss peaceful and violent verses in the Quran and how they're tied to Muhammad's life and must be interpreted in light of their historical context. Hence, the verses in the Quran that teach Muslims to live in peace should be examined within the historical context of Muhammad's life, for it is this life that sheds light on an apparently ambiguous message. This historical context also sheds light on modern aspects of Islam, which ultimately derive from the life of its founder. For instance, more than 13 centuries ago, the relatively peaceful Muhammad fled Mecca because of intense persecution. As he fled the city, he left the path of peace farther and farther behind him. He eventually returned at the head of an army, and few were brave enough to oppose him. Islamic law was suddenly supreme, with a host of bloody tales to warn its enemies. A similar phenomenon occurs in the world today. When Muslims are in the minority, as they are in America, the message is always, "Let us live in peace with one another, for Islam is a religion of tolerance and understanding." Then, once Islam has spread throughout the country, the message suddenly changes to, "Anyone who stands against the Prophet is worthy of death." Oddly enough, this tactic has been remarkably successful for Islam. Despite more than 1,000 years of bloodshed, many people are convinced that Muhammad was a gentle, humble man who never harmed anyone, and that Islam teaches its followers to be at peace with everyone who hasn't declared war on them. Then, when someone like Osama bin Laden organizes a group of Muslims in an attack against thousands of innocent people, everyone says that he must be insane, and people around the world rush to defend Islam. The result is simply amazing. Muslims commit acts of terror in Russia, Spain, America, England, Israel, and countless other countries around the world, and it actually causes certain people to support Islam even more. Think about it. A Muslim blows up a bus, but people don't want other Muslims to be persecuted for it, so they start defending Islam. Legislators are among the most active in this regard. Laws threatening free speech about Islam are popping up everywhere, even in the United States and Great Britain, declaring that statements against Islam will not be tolerated. Indeed, Australia is on the verge of sending pastors to prison for quoting passages of the Quran. Today's terrorist attacks in London, strangely enough, will help Islam grow even stronger. There will be a brief period of outrage against Islam, but once the smoke has cleared, both literally and figuratively, the world will once again rush to defend Islam, and more bills will be passed protecting Muslims from those who would speak out against Muhammad's religion of peace. No matter how violent Islam becomes, as long as people fail to recognize that its two faces are part of the same head and that both faces are calmly smiling as new laws make Islam untouchable, Muhammad's empire of faith will thrive in a world of false tolerance. Islam only spreads in three ways. One, Islam spreads through high birth rates, due to Islam not giving women many opportunities to do much besides making babies. Two, Islam spreads by the sword. And three, Islam spreads through false claims made in an atmosphere of ignorance. Here in the West, an atmosphere of ignorance is absolutely essential for Islamic dawaganda. If you want to tell people that Muhammad was a champion of women's rights, and that the Quran has been perfectly preserved, and that the Quran contains miraculous scientific insights, and that Muhammad was history's greatest man, and that the Quran is the greatest book ever written, you need a nation filled with people who know next to nothing about what's in Islam's most trusted sources. And that means you need to silence critics, or at least keep them from ever being heard. And think about how terrorist attacks do this. Some people are scared to criticize Islam because of the terrorist attacks. This is the direct silencing. Many individuals are worried that they'll get killed if they offend followers of Muhammad. During the international violent riots over Muhammad cartoons, news networks would talk about all the people who were dying in the cartoon riots, but they wouldn't show the cartoons. Why? They were scared to death. And that was the goal of the riots. It worked. But there's also the indirect silencing. After every terrorist attack, peaceful Muslims are on news programs telling us how scared they are of an anti-Muslim backlash. And how do you prevent an anti-Muslim backlash? By silencing critics of Islam, either by legislation or at least by calling anyone who criticizes Islam a racist, Islamophobic, hate-mongering bigot. This marginalizes anyone who criticizes Islam or corrects false claims about Islam, and this marginalization helps preserve the atmosphere of ignorance, which is absolutely essential for the spread of Islam. So, both peaceful and violent Muslims want people to convert to Islam, and terrorism leads to conversions. Both peaceful and violent Muslims want to silence critics of Islam, and terrorism helps silence critics of Islam. This is why I say that all Muslims benefit from terrorism. Of course, terrorism could ultimately undermine Islam. There are people who, after a terrorist attack, decide to learn about Islam, but instead of going to the local mosque and believing whatever they're told, they go to the Quran and the Hadith to find out what Islam really teaches. These are the people who become informed. If enough people eventually become informed, Islam will lose the atmosphere of ignorance it depends on. Nothing poses a greater threat to Islam than an informed population of free people. Be one of those people.